Our two speakers today will discuss the new emergency support framework, which was launched by the CQC on the 1st of May as part of their response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll be exploring what this new framework means for the adult social care sector. Both of our speakers today are judges for the Great British Care Awards, which are organised by our joint hosts, Care Talks, and recognise excellence in the sector. Our first speaker is Laura Hannah. Laura is a partner in the regulatory team here at Stephensons, and she specialises in health and social care regulation. Laura represents care providers and managers in proceedings before the CQC and the Care Inspectorate Wales, and she advises on registration, enforcement action, criminal investigations, appeals to the first tier tribunal, safeguarding investigations and inquests. She's recommended as an expert in her field by the Legal 500, and she regularly writes for various care publications. Our second speaker is Bhavna Keane-Rao. Bhavna is the Managing Director of BKR Care Consultancy and has over 25 years experience working with the CQC and its predecessors. She was part of the team that delivered the first quality framework, and in the past has worked in a variety of roles at the CQC. Bhavna is a specialist advisor to international care ethics and is on the board of the Ethox Foundation. Bhavna and her colleagues at BKR Consultancy have a proven track record of supporting services that include care homes, care villages, private and NHS GPs and hospitals, as well as children's services. They are very successful in moving providers straight from requiring improvement to obtaining outstanding ratings. And she's even managed to achieve this for homes that have been in administration. Now, without further ado, I'm now going to hand you over to the first of our speakers today, Laura Hannah. If you just bear with me 1 second, whilst I change the screen. There you go, Laura, over to you.
Thanks, Sean. So in the first part of this webinar, I will be providing you with a brief overview of the emergency support framework and what this involves, as well as looking at the summary record and the key legal considerations. So what is the emergency support framework? Well, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, and as Sean mentioned, the CQC launched its emergency support framework on the 1st of May this year in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the suspension of its inspection programme. The framework effectively sets out the CQC's approach, namely how they will liaise with providers and managers in all health and social care settings registered with CQC during this period to help them monitor the impact of the pandemic on services and identify any safety risks. Their approach involves 4 key elements: using and sharing information to target support where it's needed most, and that will involve identifying key trends and issues and sharing them with local and national partners to help them mitigate and manage risks, having open and honest conversations, taking action to keep people safe and to protect people's human rights, and capturing and sharing what they do. So what does the emergency support framework involve? Well, it essentially involves a telephone call between the manager of a service and the inspector. The CQC refer to this as a supportive conversation. The call will take place on this platform, Microsoft Teams, or by telephone. And from what we've seen so far, those calls can last anywhere from around half an hour up to a couple of hours. The call isn't audio recorded. However, the CQC will take notes of the call and a record will be kept of the discussion. At the moment, calls are being prioritised based on the CQC's knowledge of a service and information received from various sources. And services will, with a higher level of risk, will be given priority for those calls. So, for example, if you are currently subject to enforcement action, you've had a recent inadequate rating, or there have been allegations of abuse or neglect, then you're likely to have a lot more contact from your inspector and probably more than one of these calls. The calls will focus on 4 key areas, and they are safe care and treatment, staffing arrangements, protection from abuse, assurance processes, monitoring and risk management. And Bhavna will talk to you more about those areas shortly. The CQC have now published a set of questions for various types of providers, and there are a set of 15 questions for adult social care providers, which you can find published on the CQC's website. Those 15 questions are then broken down into up to around 4 additional questions or prompts, and they are intended to help you answer the main questions. The focus of the majority of the questions is on how prepared you are and how you are managing during the pandemic. The inspector might not ask all of the questions that are published. It will really depend on the individual circumstances of your service and whether they need to address all of those 4 key areas. The CQC say on their website, and they said in a recent webinar, that you don't need to spend time preparing for the engagement call and for these questions, but I would completely disagree with that stance. I think whilst this is not an inspection and your service won't be rated off the back of one of these discussions, it is in effect a type of performance assessment. Whilst the CQC say it's part of their supportive approach to help providers resolve any issues and keep people safe during this period, whatever is said during the call with the manager will be noted down and will no doubt form any judgments they make on your current compliance and any decisions they take in terms of enforcement action and future inspections. Following your discussion with the CQC inspector, you will be provided with a summary record by email, and this, from what we've seen, is usually in PDF format. This will summarise the discussions that you've had with the inspector and will be set out as a list of questions that were asked with simple, usually yes/no answers to reflect how you responded to those questions. It will also set out any specific internal and external risks and challenges that were discussed, as well as any sources of support that were suggested to you. At the end of the summary record, there will be a short summary of around 200 to 300 words, which will set out whether the CQC consider that your service is managing or needs support. It might also set out any standout examples that you've provided about how you've managed during the pandemic. So if you do have an example, then obviously share that with the inspector. The key point here, though, with this summary record is that it is not an inspection report. There are no ratings within it, and it will not be published on the CQC's website. So the usual factual accuracy process that you would get with a draft inspection report doesn't apply. It is, however, important that you do note that any serious concerns that are identified as a result of your discussion with the inspector may be shared with your local authorities, adult social care team, safeguarding team, as well as any other partnership agencies. The information obtained during the call, as I've said, will also be taken into consideration when planning future inspections and/or making decisions on any enforcement action. Whilst it's also the summary record isn't published in the public domain, it may possibly be a disclosable record should anyone make a freedom of information request, for example, as well. So let's have a look at some of the key considerations with regards to the framework. First of all, it's important to say that there's no need to worry about the new framework. It's a fairly straightforward process, and those of you that have already had an engagement call will know that it is fairly straightforward. The questions are already published on the CQC's website, so if you haven't already done so, I would recommend that you review these sooner rather than later. However, I would bear in mind that the CQC may divert from those questions. They may ask you additional questions, and like I said before, they might not ask all of those questions. The questions will, however, be based on the 4 key areas that I spoke about before. These aren't new areas, they are areas that you would expect to be asked questions on during a usual comprehensive inspection, albeit those questions are going to be more focused on how you are dealing with the pandemic. I also said that, not all of the questions will likely be asked. From what we've seen so far, some of these calls have lasted about half an hour, They haven't gone into all of those key areas. Some of them have lasted over an hour and have been quite thorough. It really depends on how thoroughly the inspector thinks that they need to look into each one of those key areas. The questions are likely to change as we move through the different stages of this pandemic, and even when the CQC start to actually carry out inspections again. So it's important that you keep up to date with any recently published questions. So make sure that you check the CQC's website regularly during this period. If there are any areas that you're worried about, any shortfalls you've identified in the course of your preparations, then it might be wise for you to develop an action plan with reasonable timescales for addressing those issues, so that if you for your engagement call, then you are prepared and you can demonstrate to the CQC that you've made plans to address those issues. Overall, the key to dealing with this framework is just to make sure that you're prepared for your discussion, regardless of what the CQC say. If you're more prepared, then you're going to be more confident in answering those questions and dealing with the call. The CQC have also made it clear that this is not a regulatory process because it's not an inspection, the findings aren't published, you're not rated. But this is somewhat misleading in my view, because the CQC are carrying out their regulatory function of monitoring services, and they are to an extent assessing your compliance in these 4 key areas by carrying out the framework. They've also made it clear that the outcome of the call will form part of their monitoring information about a service moving forwards. And what this means is that because there is no factual accuracy process for dealing with a summary record like you would have with a draft report, it is concerning to the extent that it raises the question over how the CQC can ensure that the summary record accurately reflects the discussions that have taken place. So it's important that once you receive that summary record, if you notice any factual errors with the record, or you think something that's been said is unfair, or you have evidence to suggest something to the contrary, then you must bring that to the CQC's attention immediately once received. Whilst the record isn't published, as I mentioned earlier, it could be relied on for future inspection planning, and indeed could be relied on later on to justify the CQC's use of their enforcement powers. The discussion you have with the inspector, like I say, can also lead to an inspection, even during the course of this pandemic. If the CQC is satisfied that there are serious concerns over the way you're managing, or if they consider there to be a really high risk of harm to residents. And again, like I say, that could in turn lead to the CQC taking enforcement action if they deem it appropriate. So the key points to take away from this today are, firstly, to be prepared, be ready to answer all of their questions, know what their questions are likely to be, and have any supportive documentation to hand to share on Teams, like we're sharing these slides with you today. Have someone there if you want them to take notes, if you're concerned about being able to remember everything that was discussed. Have someone there just to write down and keep your own record. And third of all, once you get that summary record, just make sure you review it thoroughly and you raise any issues straight away. I'll now pass you on to Bhavna.
Hi. Good morning. First of all, it's nice to work again with Laura. We've done some work before, so it's always a pleasure. I'm going to discuss, Laura's discussed in detail about what the summary record looks like, the emergency and support call summary record. I'm going to put some meat on the bone. So what does it feel like when you're at the receiving end of these calls, and what providers have done and how we've supported them through that? One of the first things is that, you know, because it's an informal support call, as has been noted, people tend to get confused about that. And I think that's the bit that Laura touched on, that there is no such thing as informality when it comes to CQC. It's a regulator, it enforces, and it gathers evidence. First slide, please, Laura. Right, so Laura spoke about the safe care and treatment bit and how these fit into the overall summary calls. We do have the questions, but these questions can lead into further questions. and we've mentioned, you know, what these look like. I guess for me, providers really, and I think number of managers that we've worked with have actually said that they didn't realise that these calls, while they're informal, are subject to further action if need be. We had a case where for safe care and treatment, for example, so the infection control, the PPE, how does it all work together? What do we do? How do we record it? All of that information is gathered and was shared with local authorities who then came back to do further investigation into the issues. So it's been quite clear that yes, the records may well be not published, but in the Freedom of Information Act, somebody does require those records, they will be produced and therefore becomes part of the public domain. And I'm sure that's one of the things that people really do need to be aware of. And also the overall summary, it talks about the support needed or not needed. How does it all fit into it? What criteria is it that they use to say when you need support? Is it the same criteria? For example, most care homes in the country have had problems with PPE. We know Nader Ahmed from National Care Association has said, you know, there were a number of providers who've used a number of care staff who've used marigold gloves and bins for PPEs. Are they couldn't source it, or are they going to be judged more reasonably and responsively? So again, those are the discussions I think that the manager needs to have quite clearly at the onset of that discussion, saying these are the issues that we have found and these are the issues. So safe care and treatment, and Laura again said that these are not new questions. You should be aware that these are the issues that CQC will inspect on when they do comprehensive inspection. So these are formally logged call, although it may be that it looks like an informal, and it's not an informal chit chat. But I think, you know, and we must be careful with that. Next slide, please, Laura. So one of the things that I wanted to do was drill down into what do these look like. So, for example, what kind of, for infection control, what systems do you have in place? And I would suggest that you have a folder, and which is what we've done with a number of our providers. We have a template that they pulled together, and the folder would have 4 sections. And each of the sections, so when you're on a call, it's really difficult to remember everything that you need to talk about. And I think sometimes people get distracted or get nervous, as is the case, because it is your regulator, it is your inspector. So have a folder ready with some of the issues that you know they're going to discuss. So infection control, what is it that you've got in place? And that's going to be the biggie, because it's all related to COVID-19. How do they work? How have you taken the actions that you have? What kind of risk assessments have you got in place? Did you have problem with medicines? Well, if so, what did you do? And remembering that even with any of the issues, you may well have to do a safeguarding alerts as well. And CQC may well have to ask you to make referrals if you fail to do so. So if there are medication issues, if there are equipment issues, you had issues with trying to obtain any of the things that you required for the safe and well-being of your residents, then those are the discussions and dialogues, you know, you have. So it's business as usual, but it's actually supportive. They're trying to make it supportive, but it is a regulator. Staffing. Do you have enough staffing? Number of people have had huge issues, and again, COVID has had a number of challenges to people. I think that's the bit that has had a huge impact on people. So a number of local authorities have managed to support providers, but if you don't have enough staff and you've had to rely on Dom Care Agency, what have you done? How have you done it? Meanwhile, respecting respect for privacy and dignity. Again, we've had issues where you've had to take, with the new legislation under COVID-19 legislation, number of citizens' rights have been taken away. So if you needed to isolate people, you've had to isolate them. If you had to cordon off a whole area or bring people from upstairs to downstairs, having a wing specific for positive COVID-19 positive tested people, all of those things take away people's rights. It's about that evidence gathering, evidence of your decisions. So if you're making a decision, it's out of the norm, record it, show your rationale, why you've done it, what you've done, how you want to do it, and how you want to progress through that. That's really quite important. Same with the protection. I think there are going to be lots of people going through the blame culture, so on and so forth. For care managers, be focused. You have to protect your residents and your staff from neglect, from discrimination, from abuse. How have you done that? Have the narrative ready to discuss with your inspector. Finally, I think, assurance, health and safety, well-being, monitoring, partnership, working with local authorities, the CCGs, district nurses, all of those. How have you worked together? How have you engaged with them? And also where you've got your business contingency plan, how has that informed the way that you've worked? Granted, nobody's been aware this has been a once in 100-year occurrence, so we need to really up our game when it comes to business contingency and risk assessment. Put those things in place and try and have a discussion with the inspector. In a couple of the homes we've worked in, we've actually got some of the managers have sent in some of the more evidence as well, because like Laura says, that summary report, while under the informal guide, can have further repercussions. Send it through, challenge. If you think something's not right, still send it through. They might not change it, but it's there in the system, which you can then rely on. And it is unfortunate that we're in this position where we do have to cover our backs, but it's the balance. And I think that's really, really quite critical and important. So what I would say is that CQC are trying to do the right thing. They are trying to support, but it's still a regulator. Be prepared. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhavna. We have had some questions. Bhavna, whilst you're still on the screen, if I could ask you first. Somebody's asked, what can we do to prepare our manager for the call? Yes, right. ESF call.
Right, so I think I touched on it, but for me, it's about almost a drill run. Back in the days when I was part of inspection unit, I used to always say to people, you should be prepared. You should have a script ready. Here, you've got the questions. You know what they're going to ask you. Have a dry run, because all of us will dry up. All of us get nervous. All of us, or even if we're not nervous, we forget things. So have a script ready. Have the proper words, question. And actually evidence what you're doing, even if it means that you're talking to about how you've consulted with your residents. Excuse me. And if you're going to introduce residents, excuse me, I've still not recovered fully, I'm afraid, from COVID. So when I'm talking, I still get a bit bunged up. Mm-hmm. So if you are talking to the relatives about how to engage them and bring them back into seeing the residents, it's how you're going to do those. So it's preparing, it's having a dialogue, speak to CQC, engage with them, but always remember they are your enforcer. So script ready, anything you're doing, and your business contingency plan should be there in the forefront. This was something we couldn't prepare for, but now we know what the beast looks like. We have to be prepared for it.
And will that be an informal call, the engagement and support call? How informal will it be, Bhavna?
I always think that there is no informality when you're talking to your regulator, and I think Laura's already touched on it. There is no way on earth that you're going to say something to CQC and they're going to think, okay, this service requires further support. It needs support. It won't leave it at that. So it's not an informal call. I think it lulls you into false sense of security. I really do. And it worries me. As an inspector, I used to never socialise with providers, go to Christmas meals or anything, because I was always on duty. If something happened in front of me, I had a duty of care. If CQC found something and they didn't action it, can you imagine the repercussion further on? I just think that you have to be sensible. You can try to make it as a friendly call, but they're not your friends. So they can be friendly, but not your friends. You make your own records. Keep a folder handy of what you're going to discuss.
OK, and the final question for you, Bhavna. Can the CQC use the information in the emergency record in any further action?
I think that they can. I genuinely do. They will put it as a you know, and I'm sure that you know, Laura will agree that, you know, that because it's recorded and it's part of your risk profile, it governs whether you require further support or not. They share it with local authorities. If it goes down the road, well, there are going to be a number of investigations. I know a number of care homes have had huge number of deaths, and CQC have had a number of these calls, and then use that information to govern whether they then follow it up. So it may govern the discussion for a comprehensive inspection, but I really think that they can use that, because if it goes to court, it's part of their regulations. They can call it an informal supportive call, but it'll still be there.
Okay, thank you very much, Bhavna. Quick couple of questions for you, Laura, if you want to unmute yourself. Will the call be with our usual inspector is a question that we've got.
Not necessarily. I think the CQC have indicated that they'll try and facilitate that wherever possible, but that won't always be the case due to sickness and the fact that they've had to move people around internally within the CQC. I think you'll have to bear in mind that if it's not your usual inspector, then they won't have dealt with you before, they probably won't know you or your service as well as what your usual inspector does. And so that makes it even more important that you really are prepared for the call and that you're able to answer all of the questions in as much detail as possible about how you're managing and the relevant procedures and policies that you have in place.
Okay, and could the CQC still inspect after the call's taken place?
Yes, they could do. Whilst inspections at the moment are still suspended, they have indicated that they will carry out inspections even during this period where there's evidence of abuse, neglect, breach of human rights, or they've got concerns about breaches of regulations and the standards of care and treatment that are being provided. I think before it got to an inspection, though, they would probably be looking for further assurances from the provider themselves and would consider any other intelligence that they hold about the service. I think an inspection as well at the moment, whilst we're in the midst of the pandemic, would probably have to be signed off by a senior high-level inspector as well, so it wouldn't just be straight to an inspection, and I think any inspection would be a targeted one rather than a full comprehensive inspection. Okay,
final question, Laura. Are the CQC likely to take enforcement action during the pandemic?
I wouldn't say no. I think they've made it clear that the key part of their approach and this framework is to provide support to providers, but ultimately their core role is still to regulate the sector, and that doesn't stop because there's a pandemic. I think they've previously indicated that enforcement action would only be taken in exceptional circumstances. But I would hope that they would take a more pragmatic approach at the moment, and that there would be more thought around sort of the practicalities and the reasonableness of enforcement action, particularly a closure of a care home, for example. But I don't think it would stop them from carrying out those regulatory functions if they thought it was necessary to protect people. They of course have urgent powers to close a care home, for example. Those urgent powers are used within the magistrates' courts, most of which are either closed at the moment or operating at limited capacity. But that would fall under one of the urgent cases that the magistrates' courts are still dealing with. And I think they've increasingly taken more and more enforcement action over the last several years, particularly criminal action. And during this period, whilst the pandemic has been going on, I think we've still seen action being taken. We've seen appeals being made to the first tier tribunal, although some of those have been stayed until the CQC can carry out an inspection. Cases in the criminal courts are being relisted for a later date, when they can have a proper hearing at the magistrates' courts, but it's not stopping them from issuing the enforcement action.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you to Bhavna as well. Thanks to both of our speakers. Also, thank you to Care Talks. Please remember that you can nominate for the Great British Care Awards now. And just finally, before we leave you, I just wanted to quickly tell you about some other conferences that we have coming up, some webinars, sorry, next week, same time, the 18th of June, next Thursday at 11 AM. We have Julie Hunter, who's a commercial solicitor at Stephensons, and Jeremy Huband, who is the head of health and social care at the HSBC Bank, talking about debt recovery and due diligence and credit control and the importance of maintaining healthy cash flow in these challenging times. And then the following Thursday, on the 25th of June, again at 11 AM, we have Martha McKinley, who's an employment solicitor at Stephensons, with Brendan Ryan, who's the Director of Health and Social Care at Hayes Recruitment, and Jim Thomas from Skills for Care, talking about dealing with management, performance and the well-being of staff during the COVID crisis. Hayes Recruitment have a second conference next Wednesday on the 17th of June about nursing in social care, and then we'll then have a series of webinars that follow that as well in July. So please share these webinars via social media when you see them. Keep an eye on our Twitter account and LinkedIn. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and we'll now bring today's webinar to a close. And please feel free to give us any feedback. This is our first webinar, so you know, we are learning. So if you have any constructive feedback, it would be gratefully received. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.